Okay, I think we're recording. Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Taylor. I am the creator and director of the Praxeological series on YouTube. And with me is David Ramsay Steele, an author. Are you a professor of economics,
No,
David? No. What do you
I'm an
do?
editor for a publishing company,
Oh, really?
but I've written a number of books. You're quite right.
Have you ever had a professorship of any kind?
Only in the broadest possible sense.
Okay, great. If you don't mind, maybe you could tell us some of the books that you've written. I mean,
Oh, well, recently I wrote with Michael Edelstein and Richard Kuyoff the book Therapy Breakthrough,
okay.
Why Some Psychotherapies Work Better Than Others. Before that, I wrote a book called Atheism Explained, From Folly to Philosophy. And also I wrote with Michael Edelstein another book on psychotherapy called 3 Minute Therapy. Those are my main works, apart from the book I wrote in 1990, or published in 1992, From Marx to Mises, where I discussed Mises's economic calculation argument against the possibility of socialism, and came to it basically in a favorable way. Basically thought that basically Mises was right, although there were a few little technical objections. But one of the things I disagreed with was Mises's methodology of economics, his view that the entire corpus of economic theory is spun out from self-evident axioms without any empirical research. I take the contrary view, which is more normally associated with people like the Chicago School, which is that economics is an empirical science and its claims can be tested empirically. For example, if you want to know whether the minimum wage creates unemployment or increases unemployment, the way to do it is to run a test and look at the minimum wage in operation. And there are ways to do that statistically so that you can isolate the difference made by the minimum wage. And lo and behold, what you find is that the minimum wage does increase unemployment. Now, to try to prove that the minimum wage will increase unemployment by sheer reasoning from first principles, well, you can maybe do that, but I think there are problems with trying to do that, and I don't think it's so convincing.
Okay, so just to be clear for our audience, this is actually the issue that we're going to be discussing today, whether economics or more specific or more broadly, I guess, praxeology, not whether its conclusions are correct, but whether its methodology, whether the method in which it approaches the study of human action is correct or not. Just wanted to clear that up for the audience in
Right,
case they're
right. Well, I was trying to segue in a very subtle way.
and it worked. So um, uh, I I guess the first question would be um, your claim is that something like minimum wage increases have to be empirically tested, and I guess my first question would be, what tools of measurement would one employ in order to determine whether an increase in the minimum wage was effective or not? How would one determine whether that worked or not?
You mean whether it increased unemployment?
Correct.
Well, the way that some recent studies have done it is to look at comparable enterprises on both sides of a state border, where this one state has higher minimum wage than the neighboring state, and they are able, using sophisticated statistical techniques, to show that where the minimum wage is higher, the unemployment rate is higher too. So that would be the kind of thing I would be fully in agreement with, that is now being done by economists, that Misesians would say is a waste of time, and I presume they would say is a waste of time and doesn't get you anywhere, because you already know that by pure reasoning that a minimum wage creates unemployment.
Um, Speaking on behalf of the praxeologists, I would say that no, it's not that analyzing that kind of information is a waste of time, right? Obviously, there's useful information. Obviously, one of the things that we believe that praxeology is good for is interpreting economic history and interpreting it correctly. So, I guess if we were to look at a case of one state versus another state and their minimum wage, and we find that one state has higher unemployment, that I guess the first thing is that that in and of itself doesn't tell us a rule about unemployment. I mean, isn't it possible that a state could have a high minimum wage and have more employment than a state with a lower minimum wage?
Right. Well, that is, of course, why we do science, because our observations can always conflict with our theories. That's why we do it. And yeah, that's true. And that might raise a further question as to why that was. I mean, by the way, it's not just a simple matter of seeing whether the unemployment rate is higher in the state. You would use regression analysis to eliminate a lot of factors that you thought might be countervailing factors. So you would try to identify, and of course this is a fallible process, as any empirical observation is, you would try to identify the causal relationship.
And how could you be sure that your tools of measurement to identify that causal relationship are adequate to...
Well, you can never be sure. It's the same in physics or chemistry or astronomy. You're never sure that your tools are adequate. You just, if somebody suggests that a particular tool is inadequate in a particular way, you try to improve it. I mean, the tools of measurement are fallible and can be improved in certain circumstances. And that's what goes on in science all the time. And I don't think economics is any different from physics or chemistry or astronomy.
Well, I would argue that, in fact, that's not the case. And the reason that I would give just off the bat, the first thing that comes to mind is, for example, one of the things that we're talking about here is objects of action that presuppose praxeological laws. For example, a medium of exchange. We're talking about money, right? Money is not something like, if we were talking about an increase in coins or pieces of paper that are passing from one individual to another, that in and of itself wouldn't tell us what it is that these people are acquiring, or that is what is going to achieve a higher standard of living for those people. I mean, the concept medium of exchange is a praxeological category. It only means something because we already presuppose that there is purpose behind the people that are acting to acquire it.
Well, I completely agree that in order to identify a medium of exchange, you have to make a decision about people's intentions. And that money doesn't exist in isolation from people's intentions. So in order to identify what money is, you have to have a theory about what people are trying to do. And so I'm not in favor of eliminating all reference to people's goals and assumptions and beliefs. I think that you have to use those assumptions.
And how is it that those assumptions about people's intentions, how are those observed? You know, obviously that's you just assume them and then work from there as...
Well, I think in science you're always working with a theory. The theory could be false.
Right.
So you have a theory about what people are doing when they perform certain transactions. Or when it is even a theoretical judgment that they are performing transactions as opposed to moving their limbs randomly. But if you see people behaving in a certain way, you classify it in a certain way, and that classification is a matter of their ascribing intentions to them.
Okay. So we agree.
That's a theory about them, just like any other theory. It's an empirically testable theory. And it's a theory that could be false. I mean, any theory in science could be false, and that's why science is so interesting, because the theory is always on trial and can always be tested against the observations. So one has a theory about what people are trying to do, and one uses that theory to make certain predictions about what they will do in certain circumstances, and then one comes along and tests whether they do in fact do what you expected.
Okay, so one of the tools in testing any theory is a unit of measurement and a language in order to interpret that unit of measurement, right? So science uses mathematics, correct?
Among other, and words as well.
And
Yes.
words as well. So could we agree that um, a theorem required to explain some mathematical theorem required to explain some physical phenomenon could not itself be falsifiable or denied? Like, let's say if we had to talk about right triangles in some sort of physics experiment, we could agree that that in and of itself is not something that we could deny. Pythagoras' theorem.
Well, what you're getting at here is that in Euclidean geometry, the theorems follow from the axioms, follow logically from the axioms. And of course, what one can do, and what Einstein did, is one can question whether Euclidean geometry is a good description of the physical world, and whether it's a perfect description of the physical world. And it turns out that it isn't, that the world is not Euclidean. But for many purposes, it's a pretty good approximation. If you want to build a bridge, Euclid is good enough.
Well, Euclidean, like let's say something like Pythagoras' theorem, is implied in the simple concepts of things like 1 plus 1 equals 2. Okay?
Yes.
So are you saying that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is itself an approximation and not necessarily a good descriptor of the physical world?
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, if all,
Why would you think I would be saying that?
because if all the, if in the simple concept of 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 plus 1 equals 2, if all the, if the entire edifice of mathematics is implied within those first conceptual ideas, then to say that one is not a good descriptor of the physical world would be to say that the simple the simple thing from which all the other implications of the science stem from is itself not a good descriptor of the physical world.
Are
But
you drawing a parallel between praxeology and mathematics? Is that what you're doing?
well, no, my goal was actually to say that there are already, even within physics, certain tools that are used and employed which cannot be falsified. They're not
So
empirical.
you are drawing a parallel between praxeology and mathematics.
I mean, there is a parallel, and I can draw it for you if you would like.
Yeah, and I fully accept, that people outside the Misesian universe refer to this as the pure logical choice. There is a pure logical choice, and it's very useful in economics, but it doesn't substitute for empirical investigation.
But didn't we just agree a few minutes ago that theory must precede empirical evidence and history? You have to have
Well,
a theory before you can even make any interpretation of the data. If not, you just have random facts that don't
right,
paint any
right,
picture,
right,
right?
yes.
So you have to have a proper theory before you can interpret data.
You have to have a theory. I'm not sure how proper it has to be, but
Well, if it's not
certainly.
proper, then your empirical
Well,
evidence, the story that you
yes, you might start with a mistaken theory, and you usually do, and you progress by finding the mistakes in your mistaken theory and improving it,
mhm.
or replacing it with something completely different. I
So,
mean,
so if we find a state in which the minimum wage is higher than some other comparable state, but employment is higher than the other state, does that falsify the minimum wage theory that we are trying to establish?
It's a prima facie falsification, but then you might want to investigate further. I mean, this is something that happens all the time. I mean, a classic example would be um, when some of the outer planets didn't seem to behave according to Newtonian principles. But they then somebody came up with a hypothesis that would reconcile these by saying there was a planet that hadn't yet been observed that was disturbing the orbits of these outer planets, and that was the planet Neptune, and they predicted where it would be and how big it would be and so on. So if you if you find a contradiction between your observations and your theory, it could be that you scrap the theory right away, or it could be that you try to reconcile them, but you can't just ignore the contradiction.
So, and just trying to draw the parallel. So, for example, if I have Pythagoras' theorem, which to say the opposite of this theorem would be to enter into a contradiction because it's tautological. Okay, so how exactly would I determine when the hypotenuse of a right triangle is not a squared plus b squared? You see where I'm going with this, or how would I see the praxeology is claiming that this unemployment thing is a logical truth. Okay, because
Right,
to say the otherwise would be to enter into a contradiction.
right,
It would be to say that you could theoretically um, increase minimum wage higher than what the output of a employer's actual income is, and somehow get more out of that than what's there, right?
right. But I mean,
I don't.
somebody could take the view.
Uh huh.
Now, I suspect that you and I agree that this would be a false view, but somebody could take the view that employers hiring labor um, have great zones of indeterminacy in their practice, that they're not very finely tuned to the data that confronts them, that they proceed by habit and by custom, and that therefore, if you raise the minimum wage, they'll pay a bit more to their workers, and nothing else will happen. But somebody could take that view, and it's not logically incoherent to take that view. It's contrary to a lot of observations that happens, but it's not. There's nothing illogical about that. It's not self-contradictory. So that's where the empirical test comes in. You actually look and see um,
Okay, so
what happens in
that's
real labor markets.
well, that's an interesting claim. However, I don't know how it seems to be a sort of a vague claim, right? That as you said it, that the employer, what was the term that you used? That they're not. Um, I mean, is there
You see, I think you say it's a vague claim, but I think this is what people who write newspaper stories and so on often believe. They believe that the actors in the economy uh, have great zones of indeterminacy that are settled by habit and
right?
by, by and so on.
That's the term.
Whereas economists tend to take the view, which I certainly fully agree, that
But the claim that
there's a lot of very precise adjustments in the economy.
but
But, the,
a claim
but
about
this is
that an
this is the
employer is working
question.
off of habit, right, is not a scientific. It's not like a scientific claim to try to say anything.
It's
It's
fully scientific. It's just as scientific as the contrary.
okay.
It's, it,
But even if an employer has a habitual tendency to underpay his workers, what does that mean? Does that mean that he is therefore being less efficient? Now I'm exploring this. I know that you don't adhere to this, and I don't adhere to this, but I'm exploring how I would take down this claim. Right? Okay, so an
yes.
employer has a habit of underpaying his workers. First of all, what does underpaying even mean in scientific terms? Does it mean that it's that the employer is not reaching its full potential output? Is that what that means?
I think what it means is that economic decision makers are not finely responsive to the data, that they work in great quantitative. This is a commonly held theory.
I understand, but okay, so
My point is not that it's a true theory, because I don't think it is. I think it's a false theory. My point is that there's nothing self-contradictory about it.
well, there is if what the person is trying to imply is that that an employer who has a habit of underpaying his workers does not produce the maximum potential output, because the thing is that's why in praxeology we study.
You don't think it's logically possible that employers could be failing to produce the maximum potential output?
If we're talking about the law of returns, then yes. But if we're talking about the object of action, people, someone who is purchasing a good from a producer is getting the maximum output from that action because it's the highest value in their scale of values. It's the highest end in their scale of values, right?
Right.
They engaging in the action to attain the ends that they want, which is to consume the good, is the highest thing in their scale of values. To say the opposite would be a contradiction. To say that the action that they performed is not the highest thing that they valued would be to say that, well, then therefore there's something else. But whatever they actually do is logically must be the highest value.
I think there's a distinction between the subjective, a person's subjective valuation and economic efficiency. I mean, it's entirely possible that someone engaged in production may habitually do things that are not optimal for their output because because their mind wanders, because they're not very brilliant, because they don't analyze very carefully. There's nothing. I mean, the point is, you can still say what they do is from their subjective point of view the best, and I agree with that. But that's a sort of disappointingly barren truth. It just means that if they're a bit stupid and a bit what's the word I'm looking for? Inattentive. If they're a bit inattentive and they don't notice certain things, they're going to do things suboptimally. But so what? I mean, that's whether people will be efficient or not is not something that you can prove by pure logic. Some people are habitually inefficient.
Well, we can say right. All other things equal, had we changed one parameter in the way that they acted, if we're analyzing some historical data, we say had they done this, they would have produced more of the good, right? But
right, we as an observer, we may say they're doing something that is against their best interests. But people do all the time. I don't see a difficulty with that. I don't think it's a correct account of what goes on in markets and in industry, but I think it's not a logically incoherent view. And I think that the reasons we have, the main reasons we have for rejecting that view are empirical. We see how well markets work, and we can observe and show how well markets work, and how people are impelled by competition to take account of things that their inattentiveness might lead them to overlook.
Okay, so I'm thinking about this example of the employer. In my mind, I keep thinking about a restaurant owner. A restaurant owner is suboptimally employing his, or excuse me, paying his workers. Um, so we look at the information that we're looking at and trying to interpret is obviously things of the past. Now, it seems that you're implying that if we could figure out what he's not doing correctly, then we could make predictions about the future. If he changes X amount of input, he's going to get a different output, and we can make a prediction, right? I mean, this would imply from your claim that economics is an empirical science. However, I would make the claim that there is no certainty in that claim, right? Like just because the employer has now started to pay his workers a higher wage, and that's more optimal given the parameters of the past, that would not tell me anything about how people and consumers will act towards his restaurant in the future. It could be that people, for whatever reason, just change their mind, see no value in the product the next day, right? And then your theory would fall apart because your prediction would be wrong. But even if your prediction is wrong, that's not the reason why your theory doesn't work. Your theory doesn't work because it's a contradiction. Because it would imply that people make the same decision if you put them in the same exact conditions, which not only are they epistemologically impossible to actually explain, right? Because a historical event is always an interpretation of relevant facts, but even if you had those relevant facts, people's free will is not something that can be determined. People just don't act the same in the same conditions, you know?
Well, you seem to be agreeing with me that what people do doesn't follow from a logical analysis of the categories of action. What you say seems to me to be fully in accord with what I'm saying. Is if you want to know what laws apply to human action, you have to do observation. You have to do empirical research, and then you'll find out how people actually behave.
What I just said to you, I don't have to study. I don't have to take evidence, empirical evidence, and to prove what it is that I just said. Okay, to show you why that's the case, I can say the opposite. I can say that
my point. Let me restate my point.
Sure.
If this clarifies anything. It seems to me that one can certainly construct a model on certain assumptions, which will show that within those assumptions, increasing the minimum wage will increase unemployment. That's easy to do. The question then becomes, how sure are you of those assumptions? Are those assumptions accurate? And people who dispute the notion that increasing the minimum wage will increase unemployment will tell you that the assumptions are mistaken. Now, these assumptions, I maintain in this case, cannot be derived from analyzing the pure category of human action. I agree that there are assumptions that will lead to that conclusion, but I think they're assumptions to do with the way people behave in a much more precisely delineated manner than that. So if there's a dispute about whether increasing the minimum wage will increase unemployment, how do you settle this? And it seems to me that the only way to settle it is to do empirical investigation, and you can then test this. And there have been thousands of empirical studies of the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment. And as far as I'm aware, every one of them has shown that if you increase the minimum wage, you increase unemployment. To me, when people do this, when Chicago school economists, as we used to call them, do that kind of thing, they're doing a perfectly reasonable and valid kind of project. Where now, when the Misesian sits in his armchair and says, twiddles his thumbs and says, we know that that's going to be the result regardless of the facts, it just has to be, then I maintain, first of all, I maintain that's not very convincing to people who take the other view. But secondly, I maintain it does embody certain mistakes. There is a pure logic of choice. It is useful to economics, just as Euclidean geometry is useful for building bridges. But it's not the whole. It's not the whole story. There is also the empirical investigation of the way people actually behave.
Again, I guess the real mode that, or the real thing that I have to attack is really epistemological. What evidence would count as valid evidence to prove that that raising the minimum wage doesn't work? We can think of a situation in which what you're claiming would be the opposite, right? I mean, there must be examples, I mean, that disprove your empirical evidence, right? There must be some examples where the minimum wage was raised and employment went up.
I'm sure there have been, but the point, first of all, the question is that there are 2 points here. I mean, the first is you don't just see what happens as immediately following something. You've got a theory which is has various factors. You try to control for all the factors that might, in your theory, be affecting employment apart from the minimum wage. Obviously, there are there are many factors that determine the level of employment in a state or in a neighborhood, a region, and the minimum wage is only one of them. And it could be, for example, that output is increasing, so that despite raising the minimum wage, employment continues to increase. That's entirely possible. So it's not a simple matter of just looking at those 2 variables. You'd look at dozens of variables. Any variables that anybody might suggest that were relevant, that might work against that causal relationship, then you would control for. And this is what is meant by ceteris paribus, other things being equal.
Okay, so for example, how could you? We talked earlier about how intentions, people's intentions, are a necessary thing that has to be taken into account when conducting economics. And I mean, you agree with this, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how does one empirically prove intentions? Because you can't use it as a factor that plays into economics unless you can empirically prove that it exists in the first place, right?
I don't think in science you ever have to prove anything exists. I think you have a theory and you test it. So that you can have a theory that people have certain intentions and you can test that, or you can have a theory that people have no intentions and you can test that. You're demanding of this assumption of intentions something I don't think you can get. It's not a question of proving that people have intentions or have any particular intentions. You have a theory that says this is the way people are. They have intentions, and among their intentions are, let's say, to maximize their incomes or whatever. And let's see what happens if we make this assumption. Well, it would lead to these consequences, and we look at the world and we find, do those consequences actually occur, or do they not? if they do occur, we say, well, that corroborates our theory. We haven't actually disproved it for the time being. Then if what you observe contradicts the theory, then you come up with it. You say, well, something went wrong here. Either there was some factor going on that we weren't taking account of, or maybe people don't have the intentions that we thought they did. Now, I think this kind of thing goes on all the time in economics and in other sciences. I mean, an example that springs to mind is if you look at the notion of human capital, which became I haven't thought about this for a long time, but let's say in the 1970s, the human capital started to interest economists. Why did that occur? Well, one of the reasons was because of the theory of international trade, which suggests that countries with a lot of capital will tend to export capital-intensive goods, and capitals with a lot of labor, but countries with a lot of labor but not much capital will tend to export labor-intensive goods. But empirically, it was observed that the United States exported a lot of labor-intensive goods. Now, that shouldn't be the case according to sort of simple theory of Ricardian comparative advantage, as elaborated in the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, and so on. So one way of accounting for this, and I haven't kept up with this recently, so I don't know if this is still currently viable, but one way of accounting for this is saying that a lot of this labor-intensive American exports, there's a lot of human capital involved. And that human capital theory took off from there and led to all kinds of analyses of the education system and the workplace training and so on. Now, that is an example of the interaction of empirical investigation and logical analysis, a theory, we might say. The fact that economists now talk freely about human capital, whereas 50, 60, 70 years ago, nobody ever did, it was brought about by this empirical observation that things were not happening as they were supposed to, according to pure theory of the time. And that's the sort of thing I would expect to keep on happening. The whole theory, the whole economic analysis of property rights involving the use of the Coase theorem and so on, and transactions costs and getting the same outcome regardless of the assignment of rights. That was something that somebody suggested, Ronald Coase suggested, a bold theorem, a theory about what would happen, and it was tested. It was tested in two ways. It was tested empirically by observing what occurred in real markets, and it was tested theoretically by looking for inconsistencies in the theory, and it came out of it quite well. So I think there's a constant interaction between theoretical, looking at a theory from the point of view of the theory's consistency, its rigor, its the correctness of the reasoning in the theory, and testing empirically, is the world behaving the way it would behave if the theory were true? But to me, they go hand in hand all the time. And this is the same in every science, not just economics. It's the same in physics. To me, I think it's harmful to preach that you don't need the empirical investigation, that all you need is to sit in your armchair.
I don't think
the axioms.
Well, praxeology, just as a science, doesn't talk about the value of this or the value of that when it comes to other sciences. It just simply describes a certain aspect of reality that we're trying to analyze. But the Praxeological team has never preached the the non-validness of empirical science or anything like that. We don't have anything. I don't think you can find a praxeologist out there that talks about like the harmfulness of empirical science. We simply say that it's inappropriate to study human action using empirical evidence. It's to misunderstand what human action, what the study and the laws of human action, how they would be derived. It's a lack of epistemological understanding.
Well, let me give you an example.
Okay.
Many years ago, before you were born, I was in a library and I picked up a copy of America's Great Depression by Murray Newton Rothbard.
Great book.
And in that book, um, you said it's a good book. I notice you can't keep a straight face when you say that.
All right,
In
really
that
like the
book,
book.
it says that there is no room for empirical investigation of trade cycles. That we know what causes trade cycles. It's bank credit expansion. It's been demonstrated by Ludwig von Mises, and he actually puts the word test in quotation marks and says it's absolute folly to try to test this theory. The theory is apodictically true. Well, that's really is a lot of nonsense, isn't it? Even you must admit that if we want to find out what goes on in trade cycles, we have to do some empirical research.
No, I disagree. I do actually think that that the theory of the trade cycle is an apodictic truth. To get back to, or staying on that topic, but I just wanted to say something about when we were talking about intentions. It seems to me that if you assume intentions into a study that you're conducting, there are certain logical truths just by the implication of intentions that can't be denied in whatever evidence you come up with if you're assuming it into your study.
Well, I accept that we have to assume logical truths. That's not. I don't think that's a disputed area.
So, for example,
logic is something we have to abide by.
If you're going to use mathematics as your tool of measurement, and you're going to by studying some supply of something, right? The conclusions that you come to in a study can never deny that 2 + 2 = 4 or that 1 + 1 = 2.
That would probably be unwise, yeah.
But it wouldn't just be unwise. It would collapse your entire argument, right? Wouldn't mean anything.
Well, it would mean either nothing or that you were due for a Nobel Prize in mathematics. One of the two.
I mean,
I think the former is more probable than the latter. I agree.
Right. I mean, I guess the point is that to say that if you assumed intentions into a study and then you found that that people don't do what it is that they value highest, okay? If you were to somehow prove that people don't always act according to what they actually intend to do, then you wouldn't be talking about intentions, would you? You see what I'm saying?
No, I don't.
Okay. So if I say that it turns out that while people act to achieve certain ends, it turns out that they don't act to achieve certain ends. It turns out that they really prefer the next the thing that they would have done had they not done what they did. You see what I'm saying? Like it's
yeah, I know. I can see what you're getting at.
It's shoddy logic, right?
Well, but of course, we've all had the experience of making up our minds to do something and then actually doing something different. It's called akrasia in ancient Greek, weakness of will. So, I mean, people do sometimes have a decided preference for something and then go against it. So we have to bear that in mind. But in general, I agree with what you're saying there. I don't think any Chicago School economist or any empirically minded economist would disagree with that.
Logically speaking, even if one has made up his mind to do something and ends up doing something else, if we're talking about a willful action, then logically speaking, That must have been what they preferred. No matter how many times they tried to verbally, ex post facto, disagree with what it is that they did.
You're denying the existence of acrasia,
Okay.
and that's difficult to do. But I think you can define.
I think the
I think
onus.
what you're doing there is you're giving a very special definition to the word prefer,
Okay.
and I think you can do that. But you know, I have no problem with
Well,
people devising um, systems based on reasoning from axioms. That's not the difficulty here. You can do that, and you can do it even in a very unrealistic way, as you would be if you said that people always went for what they prefer. You can do that, and it's a perfectly valid thing to do. But all reasoning from axioms by itself tells you nothing about the real world. It simply tells you what follows from your axioms. You then have to apply that theoretical system to the real world to see whether it fits the real world. And then you may be in for a shock when you find that things don't behave according to your apparently don't behave according to your theory. But let's go back to this whole question of the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, because this is something that has interested me over many years. The Misesian theory of the trade cycle is that it's based on the Mengerian distinction of higher order and lower order goods or capital systems of capital. And what it suggests is there will be investment in excessively roundabout modes of production if the interest rate is artificially lowered. Now, you say that the theory of the trade cycle just follows logically. What I would say is there are all kinds of empirical problems with that. And one of them is, supposing you imagine a system where the same kinds of goods are used at higher and lower orders of production. You know, for example, computers.
okay.
Computers are used and computer labor, the labor of techies and so on. This is an example of a factor which is used at all orders of production. So if you're going to build something to turn out widgets next week, or if you're going to irrigate the Sahara so that you'll have greater abundance in 200 years' time, you're still going to use computers. So it's not self-evident that the instruments of production that you're constructing in the course of the boom, according to the Misesian vision, are going to be any different in quality from the ones that would be constructed in the absence of this artificial boom that they say is created by bank credit expansion. So it seems to me there are problems. There are problems with saying that
wait, how do you? Let
the
me.
theory of the trade cycle has got to be without doing any empirical investigation.
Well,
it's an empirical question.
okay. Empirically, how would you determine that the computers are the same thing? Like you test them on like using physics? Is that what you would do? Just to make sure that every
Well,
computer is exactly.
they might be just the same thing bought from just the same company. I mean, where is the difficulty in saying that they're the same thing?
Because I don't know how you would determine that. I mean, your claim is if the goods were exactly the same, right?
Right.
So what you're trying to do in order to disprove that the theory of the trade cycle is not a logical apodictic certainty, you're trying to say we can imagine a society or an economy where every good is the same. That was what you said?
No, what I'm suggesting is this. If the physical nature of the instruments of production
Uh-huh.
in higher order or more roundabout systems are the same, are identical
Identical.
with,
What does identical mean? We have to establish what you mean by that. Physically identical?
look, the Austrian theory, the Misesian theory of the trade cycle hinges upon the fact that some instruments of production are inappropriate for some tasks, that they're not the same, that they're different. And that's why there is supposedly a bust in the Misesian theory, is because capital has been invested in instruments which can't be rapidly converted to a lower order type of production. That is the Misesian theory. So the Misesian theory rests upon physical heterogeneity of capital goods. Now, if there is no physical heterogeneity of capital goods,
It's not. It doesn't. I think you've misunderstood the Misesian theory of, or what we call the Austrian business cycle theory. It doesn't rest on the physical heterogeneity of goods. That's not what it rests on. This is actually something that we talk about a lot in our lessons, is about how the changing characteristics of goods that are physically identical might not constitute a supply of something. Why? Like, the question is why? It's a logical truth, and the reason is, for example, I might pay for a bottle of water at the local store here in Hell's Kitchen. I might pay $1 for it, and if I'm in Times Square, I might pay $2 for it. Physically the same doesn't constitute the same good according to my preference and the way in which I value things.
yes, but that's not the point here. We're not talking about consumer valuation of some consumer good. We're talking about instruments of production. There would be no problem, according to the Austrian theory, or I don't think it's the Austrian theory actually. That's something else we need to go into, and that is that this is not there's nothing really Austrian about Mises, in the sense that most of the Austrian economists disagreed completely with his a prioristic approach. But
Well, we don't call ourselves Austrians, by the way. We call ourselves praxeologists, to be very
right. That's fine.
Okay.
The Misesian theory rests on the idea that there is a problem because instruments of production have been wrongly made, because you have some that are no longer appropriate, and therefore they have to be scrapped. It's a real.
But that's not the reason why the boom, or excuse me, the crash occurs. The reason the crash occurs is because there are no more available resources to continue the propped up prices.
Yes, but that wouldn't matter if you could costlessly move instruments from the longer term, the higher order production to the lower order. It's only because they're physically heterogeneous, and therefore the instruments that you've been making for the higher order won't convert to the lower order, that there is a problem. And now, by the way,
you're talking about the converted.
This is part of a general problem with the Misesian theory of the trade cycle, is that it does presuppose that the economy is unable to cope with sudden, massive reallocation. That this is going to create some kind of slump. And I think the example of what happened to Western economies at the end of World War II contradicts that. It shows that it's possible to make tremendous, devastating changes in the structure of production without a slump. That what happened at the end of World War II was that vast areas of industry, which had been adapted to one kind of production, producing jet fighters and aircraft carriers and all kinds of military stuff, were suddenly converted away from that into totally different kinds of production, and there was no slump. So the whole notion that the underlying assumption that it's an economic earthquake if suddenly you find that lots of equipment is ill-adjusted to its current purpose is wrong, or at least it is wrong on some empirical occasions in
Well,
history.
I don't know the specific content of that historical event, but I can ask you. I'd like to ask you some questions. Was there no meddling by the you said the British, right? The British economy? Was there
I was
no?
thinking primarily of the U.S. economy,
Oh,
but
the U.S. economy. Was there no inflation of the money supply by the American government? Was there no expansion of credit? I mean,
I mean,
obviously,
I don't know what you're getting at
what I'm
exactly.
trying to
But
get at is
my point is simply this: there was a tremendous sudden need to reallocate stuff out there in industry,
and
um,
how was it
and
paid for?
it happened without a slump.
Okay.
That's my point.
Is it
But
possible that a slump could be avoided by withdrawing savings from citizens?
by doing what? Sorry, you were breaking up a bit there. What?
Is it possible that a slump could be avoided by withdrawing saved money and saved resources from the past?
Well, maybe it is, but I mean, look, it's part of the Misesian theory of the trade cycle that when the slump hits, nothing can be done about it. You just have to ride it out. In other words, it's not their theory is that because of the misalignment of physical instruments of production, there is no alternative to a slump. Nothing can be done in the way of, according to the Misesians, this situation has been brought about by manipulation of money and credit, but no further manipulation of money and credit can cure this situation. So,
No, but it can delay it, right?
right, so you're saying that that what happened in the 1940s was that the slump was delayed. Well, it
Well,
began
like I
the
said,
biggest boom in
I don't
history.
know that
The
I don't.
biggest boom in history began in the 1940s.
Uh-huh.
When at a time when all kinds of physical instruments of production were totally misaligned with their new requirements because of the end of the war. What I'm pointing out here is that it may seem intuitively plausible that misalignment of physical instruments of production, real consequences of distortions of investment, are going to create a catastrophe. But it may be that the economy is such that under certain circumstances, there is no catastrophe. It just rides it out. And I think that that's a really strong counterexample to this basic assumption of Misesian um, uh, economic trade cycle theory.
Well, so that would imply certain things that it's my goal here now to show would be contradictions, right? So
Right. You've got a hard job there. Yeah.
yeah, uh, it's been a while since I've talked about the business cycle, but what that would imply that you can avoid a bust. It would imply that interest rates and the prices of goods and services are actually reflecting um, the demands of the consumers, uh, which is not the case, right? Because uh, the interest rate is the outcome of people preferring things and people's preference for things sooner rather than later. When when a government engages in lowering interest rates, really what they're doing is they are saying that people prefer things sooner rather than later, beyond what their natural tendencies are. So um, what should be implying is that the time and savings that were withdrawn at the time of credit expansion um, don't have to be replenished, even though consumers didn't actually feel that way at the time in which they were withdrawn, if that makes any sense.
Look, I think that the Misesian theory of the trade cycle is quite plausible once you make certain assumptions. But what I'm saying is that that's a very different thing from saying that it logically follows from certain basic truths about human action. I'm drawing a distinction. And it seems to me that there are certain assumptions made in the Misesian theory of the trade cycle, where you can give counterexamples where they don't seem to apply. Now, I don't know if we want to get into this, but I mean, do you think the current low interest rates are a result of government policy? Do you think we have low interest rates now just because the government has decided that we should have low interest rates? Or do you think that it's the real factors making for low interest rates, and the government is actually rather powerless to control the level of interest rates? You see, the assumption in the press and constantly in discussion is that we have low interest rates now because the government is afraid of the recession and wants to stimulate things. But there is also an alternative theory that the government has very little control over interest rates except in the short run, and that we have low interest rates now for quite different reasons. That the government is unable to control, and that 4 or 5 years from now, it could be that you'll see interest rates rise despite all the government's best efforts.
Well, there is a natural interest rate, which is the result of the way in which people act. And that has nothing to do with what the market interest rate is, right? So,
well, it has something to do with it. But yeah, right.
Well, the interest rate that are being set by banks is completely controlled by the government.
You think that?
In the situation that we are now, yeah. Well, of course. I mean, they
Okay.
have
All right.
rules. They can't deviate from those things, right? But the time market, the market at which credit is actually loaned in the black market and things like that, doesn't necessarily reflect what the interest rate is in the official, market that we know of today. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think you're expressing the conventional wisdom quite well.
The interest rate that loans get traded at in the secret dark pools and stuff like that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the interest rate at which loans are released out, by Chase or Bank of America. So there's a true or natural interest rate, and then there's the government edict. So if you're asking me, do I think that the interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets for loans, for banks that are federally insured and all that, do I think that the government's in control of that? Yeah. Yep. Well, obviously, but I mean, I'm interested in hearing your this theory. Is this something that you adhere to?
I just think it's an interesting theory.
Oh.
It's certainly something that Milton Friedman adhered to, which is, Milton Friedman several times stated that it's just a tremendous fallacy that the government is able to control interest rates, and that the current level of interest rates is due to a government edict. I mean, the most obvious thing that would tend to counteract this view would be that in order to maintain a particular interest rate, the government in its sales of Treasury securities has to sell them at such a level that the market will accept them, and that there's obviously a purchaser effect upon the interest rate there, right?
Yes. I mean, I think Milton Friedman is correct. The government is powerless to control interest rates indefinitely. But in the short run, they can expand credit by selling treasury bonds and things like that, and uh, force people to dig into their savings in a situation in which they otherwise wouldn't.
Right. Well, we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of years to see who's right about this.
Um,
We'll do an
I,
empirical test.
well, if the crash were to happen after you die, then
The
how
crash
would
has happened, hasn't it? Or are you expecting an even bigger one to come along shortly?
yes, and the logical certainty I have is because the crash wasn't really allowed to. I mean, all the bailouts, right? So it wasn't really allowed to finish and have prices go to reflect what people's demands are and things like that, and the interest rate to rise to what people are actually feeling, which is that right now, rather than pulling out loans, the proper thing to do is to save and not try to satisfy desires so soon because of the lack of resources within the
Okay.
economy.
Okay.
So, I
Okay.
mean, do I
Well,
think a crash is coming? I would say to you that I'm absolutely sure that a crash is coming, but can I tell you when it's going to come? No. I mean,
right.
that's something that we talk about a lot in praxeology. Is that this is not a science of prediction. It's a science of qualitative explanation about the rules that govern action.
Right. But I mean, yeah, I don't think we need to get sort of hung up too much on the technicalities here. But I mean, it does seem to me that um, if the present recovery continues and if we have a sustained boom over the next few years, um, this will place your theory in jeopardy. I mean,
Well, just
by your theory, I mean your theory that the big collapse has yet to come.
you mean
Uh,
it'll place our public relations in
no. I simply mean that you have a theory that because of misallocation in the economy, there is the need for a big slump. The slump has not been big enough, according to you, to take care of that. It's been artificially propped up. Um, the economy has been artificially propped up. Now, it seems to me if we have a recovery for 6 months, you're okay with that because you can say, well, um, then it's the big clean out, the big readjustment has yet to come. But if the recovery goes on for 6 years, it seems
well,
to me to argue that 6 years from now that that misallocations in the economy prior to 2008 have not yet been fully worked out. Seems that to me that's a rather tenuous and very difficult position to take.
I think logically speaking, as long as there's government intervention, then it doesn't qualify as recovery. The term recovery
Well,
doesn't
it
qualify
could be a
because
recovery in the sense that people are better off and unemployment falls and output increases and there could be in these uncontroversial ways there could be recovery, right?
um, again, I can't call that recovery. I can call that postponement of the inevitable readjustment that must happen. Um, it's like I guess the analogy would be to say that a man got drunk over New Year's and he hasn't experienced a hangover yet because he continues to drink,
Right.
but he's not recovering in any sense of the word, right?
But if 10 years later he still hasn't had the hangover, I
Right.
think your
He
theory
keeps
about
drinking.
his subdued hangover begins to look a bit shaky.
It would if people look at it if people accept the validity of empirical evidence to study human action. But if people start to agree with the logical truths that praxeology tries to put out there, then it won't look so ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now you're right. We seem to be very popular in times of busts and very unpopular in times of what you call recovery or prosperity or seeming prosperity, right? Because the whole thing is we try to say it's an illusion. It's not true prosperity. It's a withdrawal of capital. It's consumption of capital, things that were saved in the past, and don't reflect how people would act if they weren't in a state of intervention. So yes, I understand that people might start to dismiss the Austrians as they have in the past during other recessions and depressions and things like that. If another crash doesn't occur in 10 years or whatever, that wouldn't mean that what we're saying is not true. It would just mean it would be a public relations issue.
But as well as the possibility of crashes not occurring, there is also the possibility of crashes occurring for obviously different reasons. I mean, for example, the recent crash was presumably in large part due to the government's mortgage policy over some years, and that's not a classical case of bank credit expansion. The housing, the idea that the housing market is the origin of the recent crash doesn't really fit with the Misesian theory. It's a different theory. And similarly, if 10 years from now there is a crash due to the deficit and government defaulting on its obligations, then that wouldn't be the same as the Misesian theory of bank credit expansion. It would be a different kind of crash, right? So it wouldn't really corroborate the Misesian theory, just as the recent crash didn't really corroborate the Misesian theory.
The theory that it had to do with the housing market? Well,
yeah, the theory that it's basically due to the housing market, yeah.
Well, who was giving out loans for housing? And where did they get that? Where did that credit come from?
Right, but this is yeah, of course, it's the government's responsible. No, I don't think there's any dispute about that, at least among libertarians. But the question is whether it occurred by changing the structure of production, by lengthening the structure of production in the classic Misesian manner, and I don't think it did.
You don't think that people entered into longer structures of production, like building homes that were not desired? And or building, skyscrapers and the like.
People were encouraged to take out mortgages on homes they couldn't afford.
Right.
But that's not the same as that's a matter of consumer credit. It's not a matter of people irrigating the Sahara, right? It's not a classic Misesian mechanism.
Well, okay. So something interesting about that. About the way in which the people talk about that issue is that had the subprime mortgages not been given to people who could not pay them back, that somehow we would have avoided that crash. I mean, I guess that's the theory, and that kind of seems to contradict the Misesian or Praxeological theory.
Well, it doesn't necessarily contradict it, but it's a different mechanism of creating a
cycle. Well, it's pretty simple to see that even if there were proper laws instituted and enforcement of those laws to avoid those subprime mortgages going to people who couldn't pay them. Well, really what would have happened is that these banks would have had a tremendous amount of credit that they couldn't give to people that, to the little people, but so what? So they would have lent it out to other businesses that would invest it in business in products that aren't desired by people to consume, and eventually they would lend it out, or they would employ it in some way, or they would invest it in the stock market. It just would have gone in a different direction, but it would have ended with the same result.
I think that's a difficult case to make. I mean, the money came into the system through Fannie and Freddie, and I don't see any argument that it would have come into the system by some alternate route if it hadn't come into the system.
If Fannie and Freddie I mean, again, I'm not like an expert in every minutia of what happened in 2007, 2008. However, just since you mentioned them, if Fannie and Freddie had an extraordinary amount of credit just sitting there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They would have to sell. They would have to sell it off to someone that can buy it up, right?
So
They're
you
not
think
just.
it would have found its way into industrial?
It would have found its way somewhere and caused, a misallocation of resources in some other part of the economy, and the crash would have happened anyways. It just would have been blamed on something else.
Right.
And I'm just saying this by the logic of of business and the loan markets. You can't just sit on extraordinary amounts of loans and not give them away. The reason that we had this problem with the housing market is because competing firms, competing banks, or Fannie and Freddie and Bank of America and Chase or whatever, were all sitting on easy credit, and if they didn't loan out that money, they were losing potential customers. They had to liquidate the extra credit that they had, because if not, they're losing profits, right? I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
can
just the
see that.
logic
I
of
can see the
competition.
argument. Yeah.
So if they had not been allowed to give it to people that couldn't pay it back, they would have sold it off um, to other smaller banks and other credit unions, which then in turn would have lent it out to people who couldn't pay it back. Or if the rules were so strict that only wealthy people could do it, then wealthy people would have either invested it in the stock market, or they would have created businesses that were untenable and not really desired by the economy. And eventually, there would be a rise in prices when people realized that there weren't enough resources to continue such long structures of production, and there would have been a crash then.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's. I'm just telling you that that's the interpretation from a praxeologist about what would have happened had the housing market situation been different, and therefore the claim that the housing market that the situation doesn't fit into the Misesian paradigm or whatever, I think seems to be misunderstood. If you understand it from the way in which I just explained it, then there's nothing controversial or different. There's no contradiction in the way in which we experienced a crash in 2008.
Well, the difference is, I mean, I just reiterate this. The difference is that um, ordinary middle income people buying houses they couldn't afford uh, is not the same as people building factories that are too higher order in their orientation to the structure of production. It's just different. That's all I'm saying.
And I agree with you. The
But let me
qual
ask
the
you this. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. What do you think is the role of empirical research in economic theory?
I don't think that I think that the role of empirical research is important for economic history, but not economic theory.
Isn't it possible that empirical research may turn up puzzling facts, which then stimulate people to revise economic theory?
Uh, I would say not if economic theory is practiced properly and epistemologically consistently in an epistemological way.
Well, that's remarkable.
Um, Again, I know that we were sticking to these what you called first principles, are very specific beginnings of where we would have to start in order to prove whether we're right, whether you're right or whether I'm right. We were sticking to that at the beginning, and then we kind of veered off. But I think that is really where the conversation has to continue, because the question really is epistemological. What can you know certain information using your method or my method when it comes to human action? And I would make the argument that there is no way, without assuming in things that are part of what I believe in, you cannot make certain claims about human action such as things that pertain to unknowables like will, right? Like a person's will or soul or whatever you want to call it. Those things have to be assumed in order to start talking about human action, and therefore they set you up with certain axioms that you have to create. And those axioms, while they may seem simply tautological, they actually do tell you things about the real world, and they are useful. For example, like the theory of the business cycle. That's something that stems out simply from that first axiom of human action. However, it's a useful tool to interpret past recessions and past depressions.
But it seems to me, if you look at the history of economics, that it's continually been transformed by empirical observations.
I want to stop you right there. I agree with you absolutely, which is why we chose not to call our series on YouTube economics.
Okay.
Because we found a frustration with having to debate what economics is and what we're talking about. So we don't even employ the term economics except for whenever we want to talk about a disagreement with some conclusion. We refer to people from your camp. I mean, I don't even want to give your camp a name, right? You're just David Ramsay Steele. I don't know if are you a professional economist? Did you go to school for that?
No.
Okay.
Well, no, I've read
Okay.
a bit of economics, but
Great. I don't even want to. I just want to say that we refer to economics as the empirical method of studying human action, which we believe to be invalid, and we refer to ourselves as praxeologists. And when we talk about praxeology applied to markets, we call it catalactics instead of economics because we think it's a more accurate term. It means that all the laws of praxeology that apply to autistic exchange, where people, when I'm just exchanging with myself, apply to the concepts of interpersonal exchange. Markets.
Right. What I'm really getting at is that if we look at say Mises' book Human Action, and we look at the what he sees as the structure of praxeological theory, we're seeing a lot of stuff that began with empirical observations.
Oh, absolutely, and he talks all about that in his book Human Action. He talks about how people first came up with the first economic theories out there. And yes, you're right, they were the result of empirical evidence. However, the logic that they described after the fact of their empirical observations was logically true. And he talks about how praxeology is just a continuation of that economic logic. Things like opportunity costs and things like that apply to markets also apply to all human action, even actions that have nothing to do with money or economic calculation. Because obviously, opportunity cost when it comes to economic calculation is something that you can explain very easily, right? Like if David Ramsay Steele makes $10 an hour at his job, and then he goes and spends 4 hours doing something, and the market price for that thing that he spent doing that service is more expensive, and he thinks he saved some money, but he would have made more money at work. It's something that you can calculate, right?
Yes.
You can calculate because you have a common denominator, which is money. You have dollars or whatever. That's economic calculation, right?
Okay.
Okay, so that logic of opportunity cost applies to things in which you cannot economically calculate as well.
Well, and this is something which all economists would accept.
Well, I'm not so certain, but I'll take your word for it.
The big expansion of economic theory into non market areas of human experience. The public choice approach to political institutions, the Gary Becker's work on the family and other institutions. All this was done by non-Misesians who accepted an empirical approach to economic theory. It wasn't done by Misesians. Misesians played no part in that. And incidentally, they play no part in anything that's new in economics because it's a very barren and sterile methodology because it implies that we already know everything. So this is not when you say that we can apply economic theory to non-market areas. That's nothing. That's not at all distinctive of Misesian school.
Well, I also don't want. I don't want to. I want to defend against the claim that the Misesian arguments imply that everything that we already know everything because uh, on the one hand, I think that there's been a lot of advancements recently in our theory in the expansion of praxeology and just to give you an example, like Mises has finished most of his important work, I guess, prior to like 1957 or whatever, whenever he published the Human Action. And later in the 60s and 70s, Rothbard expanded with things like a theory of like state power and things like that, which relied on praxeology as the theory, and is an expansion of praxeology. Um, there's areas that haven't been covered, like thymology. There's an area there that Mises talked about, like right before he died, about applying praxeology to to things of the psyche and tensions and things like that. And there's been expansions in intellectual property theory.
But not by Austrians, not by Misesians.
Intellectual property, yeah, sure. David
Primarily
or
not. Primarily not.
Stefan Kinsella, right? He's the one that he's like, as far as I know, the foremost attacker of intellectual property.
Oh, I see. I thought you were talking about the property rights
You're talking
approach.
about defenders of intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about people that talk about the invalidity of intellectual property, how it's not a valid
Right.
concept.
And what
Um,
view do you take of that?
I agree with that.
Okay, so do I.
Okay, great. So you don't mind if I make a copy of your book, huh?
No,
Oh, great, great.
I don't
Uh,
mind, but my publisher might.
yes, absolutely, and that's really what intellectual property is. It's not that you have a valid claim to a book that I purchased, but really that that your publisher has defense on behalf of the government to stop people from using their own machinery to make a copy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
Right.
The other important thing that I think that we're working on in praxeology and in our field and with our scholars or whatever is we're working on merging ethics and praxeology and trying to really marry those two sciences and try to talk about how they're really one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
So another big advancement, as far as we're concerned, is obviously Rothbard's like ethics, and then kind of expanded by Hoppe, things like that, and Rothbard uses a lot of praxeologies. I mean, and this is not even praxeologies, right? I guess it's the old economists use it too, which is like Crusoe economics and things like that, to explain his theory of ethics in his book Ethics of Liberty, excuse me. So I'm just trying to say that I don't think that necessarily praxeology implies that everything is known. There's definitely areas in the book Human Action, I'm sure you've read it, where he talks about areas that have not been well defined in praxeology.
Mm-hmm.
We actually, our show, we're kind of proud of having, you know, it's not a huge change in the lessons of Mises and Rothbard, but there's an area there in one of our lessons where we talk about labor versus leisure, and we slightly modified it, and we think we're more accurate. Um, I don't actually remember the specifics of it because it's been a while since I dealt with that episode, but we did actually change some of the rules. And if you'll probably find it interesting, Rothbard actually said that the this labor versus leisure thing, which I can't fully remember the specifics of, he writes in his book Man, Economy, and State that it is an empirical truth. That people, I think this is what it is. I think he says that it's an empirically observed fact that people prefer leisure over labor. He says it's not necessarily a praxeological truth. It's not a logical truth. It's not something that if you were to say the opposite is a contradiction. And that's where we changed and tried to actually marry it more to a more axiomatic truth. No, in fact, people must prefer leisure over labor.
Oh, you're trying to come up with arguments that it is a logical truth.
Yes, and mm-hmm. I mean it's not, and we don't feel like I'm speaking on behalf of me and my former writing partner. I don't think that we tried. I think we succeeded.
Okay.
But I can't remember all the arguments at the moment. But I can refer people to that video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. So I've taken a lot. We've taken a lot of time talking about this. I'm not sure if we've reached any true conclusions. I don't think you're necessarily going to stop talking about the necessity of empirical evidence for economics anytime soon.
Yes, well, I mean, I did state my views on this in From Marx to Mises, 1992, and I happened to glance at it the other day, and I was struck by how little I disagreed with it after all these years. So I still haven't modified much the view I took there, which is that on the issue of economic calculation and socialism, Mises had a good point, although I think he got some minor details a bit wrong, or at least the way he stated it was liable to be misunderstood. But I think in terms of the methodology of economics, he was seriously wrong. And I think that this doesn't matter much, but I think that actually did, as a practical matter, undermine his ability to convince people of some of his other conclusions. So, for example, if you look at left-wing people who looked at Mises on economic calculation in the early days, in the 30s and 40s, you find they tend to assume, because they know Mises is an a priorist, they tend to assume that Mises is saying that he can demonstrate with a few sentences that socialism can't exist. And that obviously is a mistake, and they therefore felt able to dismiss Mises, whereas when they dealt with Hayek's arguments, which on the question of socialism are fundamentally the same as Mises's arguments, but Hayek, of course, was not an a priorist. He didn't believe in praxeology as the source of all economic theory. They found it harder to dismiss Hayek. So Hayek was more effective at getting a hearing among people who might be persuaded than Mises. And that's partly because of Mises's unfortunate stance on methodology.
But that in and of itself is not a disprove. That's not a valid way of disproving what it is that Mises said. You haven't said that he was wrong, that people
Right.
proved him
No,
wrong.
I agree. It's
You're
not. I
talking
mean,
about.
I've given my reasons why he was wrong, and this is something separate. That that his being wrong on this point, or his taking the view he did on this point, did actually lead to him being less persuasive than
Well,
he might have been.
we try to be as persuasive as possible by putting a very attractive woman as the star of our show.
Oh,
And I
okay.
think that
Right.
no, I'm just kidding, but you know, the question of public relations, I think, is really really important, and that's why I shaved my facial hair before making this video. You know,
Oh, I
it's
didn't bother to do that. So, especially since it's New Year's Day.
it's not really showing.
But, um,
But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that I think Mises, as I remember, you wrote in your book when I read it a long time ago. I think he had little patience for people that disagreed because, as far as he was concerned, he was right, and he didn't have time for to try to explain himself all the time. I think Rothbard was better than he was. As much as Rothbard kind of rambled and whatever, he was a little bit better at convincing the average socialist or empirical economist of some arguments, at least in person, right?
mhm.
Um, in writing, I guess he was slightly less sober than Mises, but he was. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure who in the mainstream could get through Man, Economy, and State unless they found it completely fascinating as I did. I don't know. Did you have you read it?
Yeah, yeah. I own a copy. I used to consult it regularly, but I gradually lost interest in it. I think the whole approach is basically misconceived.
Um, and rather than, I mean, I guess all the arguments that you've given to try to talk about why it's misconceived have never attacked its its first principles or its the conceptual axioms. Like it's always been, like you've never said during this entire talk that um, human action is not purposeful behavior, or um, you've never said that action is not employing means to attain ends, or that you've never said it is not true that that each successive unit of a homogeneous supply satisfies a less urgent desire. You know, you haven't disagreed with any of those first implications of what action means.
And I don't think many people would disagree with those.
So rather than talking about something large like the business cycle, I think what's really important is to determine at which point in the logical chain of deduction you find the problem. You know, rather than going all the way to a large conclusion, which, like, for example, the business cycle is one of our last episodes. It hasn't even been published yet. But that is like, I think it's the 29th episode. So that's one of the most complicated things. And I think really, if we figure out at which point of the bricks that praxeology lays, at which point you say this brick is unsound and doesn't make any sense, then that's really where we can have the real discussion. You know, that's I think that's what we need to determine. And I think if you write your next book, I think that's exactly where you should focus on is is really figuring out which brick that is that you disagree with. Um, because I haven't heard it except for, I mean, except for a large conclusion, in which case I guess the when we start at such a large conclusion, I have to start by laying all the bricks to lead to explain how that large conclusion
Well,
is reached.
what I would say is simply this: that
Hmm.
we constantly come across issues um, which we have to decide one way or another. Um,
Just be pragmatic and make a choice.
For example, is there such a thing as a liquidity trap?
Okay.
I don't think that kind of issue can be settled by theorizing, by logical deduction from axioms. I think it has to be settled empirically. We go and we look at the way people behave in markets, and then we decide either the theory that there is a liquidity trap is corroborated or it's refuted. And there are just thousands and thousands of issues like that where we have to decide. I mentioned the effects of the minimum wage, and I think that the only way to decide is to look at the facts, look at the real world, investigate empirically. So that's where that's my difference from now. I think if someone tried to say that they could arrive at the settlement of those issues without doing any empirical work, they could actually do it all praxeologically, I would say you've made a mistake somewhere. And if anybody's interested, maybe we could look closely at your reasoning to see where the mistake comes in. But that's, to me, that's completely subordinate. It seems to me that there are all these issues, especially policy issues, but also just factual issues about what's going on in the world, where the correct way to approach it is to do an empirical investigation.
And I would say that anyone who claims that they have some knowledge of the world when it comes to, when in regards with human action, that they've simply observed, is usually trying to pass an incorrect theory without being explicit about it. And I think that the history is riddled with the history of people who have attempted to make predictions about how people will behave and failed. And that's precisely because the method in which they were approaching trying to determine how humans, what the laws that govern human action are, can be decided empirically and through the method of the natural sciences. I mean, I just read like 2 days ago that the Soviet Union spent over $1 billion trying to do mind control experiments. And whatever happened with that?
Well, maybe they found out they couldn't do it.
After $1 billion, right? Or someone might say, another one of your colleagues who believes in empirical evidence might say, well, if it had been 2 billion, that might have been enough, right?
Now, how what's meant by mind? I'm not quite clear what's meant by mind control. I'm sure it's possible to control minds to some extent, but yeah, I mean, the fact that the Soviet Union spent a lot of money on ridiculous nonsense, it doesn't surprise me.
Well, I'm glad you think it's ridiculous nonsense, but I think the responsibility of us as people who want to practice to be scientific is to actually elaborate on why it's nonsense, not just call it nonsense, right? Explain why it's impossible to control a willful response to controlled stimuli.
Well, if we take extrasensory perception instead of mind control, that somebody sitting in a room somewhere looks at cards and tries, or doesn't look at cards, but tries to guess what cards somebody else is looking at. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that more than $1 billion has been spent on research in the West into extrasensory perception, especially by the parapsychology faculty at Duke University. And I think there are very good general grounds for thinking that there is no such thing as extrasensory perception of that sort. But they seemed for a while to be getting good results that corroborated the possibility of extrasensory perception. And it seems to me from what I've read that as they tightened up the controls and were very careful to avoid all possibility of fraud or self-deception, that the positive results went away. But if they had found that there was some non-random effect here, that would have been very interesting and might have opened up a whole new area of inquiry, but it didn't. So I don't think it was necessarily all wasted, all that effort. But of course, it's true that presumably, like the Soviets,
the difference is it's not wasted because people are voluntarily paying for that, right?
Well, but people can voluntarily pay for something that's a waste of time. Like lots of people voluntarily went.
It's not a waste of time to. I mean,
well, look, after the First World War,
you can't say that about
people went to see spirit mediums to contact their husbands who'd been killed in the war, and that was wasted effort because spirit mediums cannot give you contact with dead people. So people can make mistakes.
As far as we've empirically found, that's not the case, right?
Hmm?
As far as we've found, that's not the case, right? Obviously, you're not 100% sure about what you just said.
That people can make mistakes? I'm pretty sure.
No, that people can't communicate with spirits.
I'm pretty sure of that too.
How sure are you?
As sure as I am that there exists a place called Australia. That has kangaroos in it.
Okay. I mean, I'm trying to be sarcastic here, but I'm just attacking the empirical method, right? You can never be 100% certain.
Well, no, I think, you see, asking about 100% certainty as a way of trying to discredit the empirical method isn't really appropriate.
Well, I'm not trying to discredit the empirical method. Obviously,
what you do in empirical research is you make observations to test theories that you have. Now, in the case of going to see spirit mediums, that's not your intention, but you do that. You're inadvertently testing the theory. This is all you can do with empirical research is try to test theories.
Yes, and obviously I think the usefulness of the empirical method in certain areas is absolutely undeniable. And so I want to, before I let you go, I definitely want to express that as a praxeologist and every praxeologist that I've met here in New York, nobody would venture to say that the empirical method is not useful when used in the proper context. It's just
well, good.
Yeah,
I'm relieved.
And I'd be very interested in having some more formally written debates with you if you're interested in that.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah. Sometimes it helps identify where the disagreements are a little bit more accurately than in a one-on-one conversation, because we have time to gather our thoughts and do a little bit of research and this and that. So, how does that sound, David?
Yes, that sounds great.
Good. Well, I think that as we approach the 2-hour mark, I think that's a good time to sign off.
Okay.
I hope you had a good New Year's.
And I hope you did too.
Yeah, this is the first day of the year of 2014, so I think it was a good discussion to have as we enter another year and continue our search for truth and all that.
Right. Absolutely. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. You have a good day in Chicago, and I will bid you goodbye now from New York.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the discussion.
Thanks, Robert. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.